Going back to the 1960s for a second, and you and I had an exchange on Twitter kind of about inflation and what really drives it. And you made an interesting point, which is that inflation is not really, I think, who is it? Milton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary
Yes.
phenomenon. And I think you said inflation is always and everywhere a political phenomenon. And that really we have this fantasy that there could be the Federal Reserve could just have this dial and turn it to 2%, 3%, 4% inflation, and that it's just sort of this technocratic thing that we just sort of set the level and sort of aim for it. And when you say it's never really like that it's a sort of a myth or a fantasy that the Fed could do that. Explain this a little bit further, this misconception that everyone has about what really drives inflation.
In fact, today I think the Wall Street Journal had an article about people we don't understand inflation. And I think a week ago they had a paper by Cecchetti and a bunch of others on what predicts inflation. It's inflation itself, So, I mean, I think here is a basic issue with the monetary view of inflation. If the monetary view of inflation were right, we would have a pretty stable velocity, but we don't have. Velocity of money keeps changing around a lot, So, which means the very basic, the money, quantity of money equation doesn't work. Now, they have bells and whistles, they have sophisticated explanations now, but those are all post-facts justifications, rationalizations rather than and a basic understanding. But inflation is a very complicated process. But let's start with what happens, what you need to get inflation up. The most important component of cost is, of course, labor costs, right? So if you look at the economy, is a circular flow. So if prices go up and they reflect in higher incomes, okay, then people have bid up, then those prices can be justified by people having higher incomes because they can go and, again, purchase those things, right? Which then bids up the prices. That's how you get a wage price spiral. I'm keeping the Fed out of the picture for now. In our economy, so the critical thing is the labor should have some bargaining power to be able to say, okay, prices have gone up, I need to be able to get my wage hikes. But if you have an economy with a tremendous amount of slack, which we have had over the last 6-7 years, but generally speaking, if you look at the last 30 years, most of the time we have spent above NAIRU, according to the CBO's definition of NAIRU. If you look at the unemployment rate, most of the time it has been above NAIRU. Whereas if you go back to the 50s and 60s, we used to spend most of the time under NAIRU. Okay, so the labor doesn't have the bargaining power, and of course unionization has declined. There are other factors as well. There's global competition. There was not much global competition in the 50s and 60s. So we don't have inflation, the underlying dynamics for the wage price spiral. On top of that now comes in how does the Fed policy change and what are the reactions to it, which there is some political element to it. Clearly, the Fed is not completely immune to politics, much as we would like to believe. And so the Fed has done some research. I think the Yash Mehra, he has broken down the inflation into 3 separate distinct episodes. The period up to 66, post-war period up to 66, and 66 to 82, and 82 onwards. So if you look at the early period, there is not much pass-through from the wage price inflation dynamics never really got started because the Fed used to take the punch bowl. William Martin, who was made the famous statement, our job is to take the punch bowl away. And this broke down in the 66 to 82 period, where there was much more of the wage price spiral dynamics. And then post-82, it has not. But there is more than just the Fed taking away the punch bowl. Joan Robinson had a very perceptive essay. So much credit is given to Phelps and Friedman, but all of these was presaged by Joan Robinson and the other Keynesians. I think this was in 61. She was writing about how we have such tight employment, high employment in the immediate post-war era, but we haven't seen the inflation pick up. And she said, part of this is the solidarity and the sense of national purpose that the war engendered. And there was a sense of restraint among labor, especially and unions, because there was a lot more unionization back then, that we should not be greedy or, we have to, there is a larger shared purpose. And I was talking to David, and my partner, and he was telling me the other day that there was a general sense that you would get wage hikes that would be commensurate with productivity. That was the general sense in the 50s and the 60s. What broke the trend was, I think it was a machinist union. I'm not 100% sure it was a machinist union in 66 who got a 6% raise or something like that broke that trend. And then the other unions now obviously had to catch up to that. And then you got started with the wage price spiral.
Well, I mean, on that note, is there any chance that we get something that encourages some sort of wage increase in the coming years? Because you're painting, again, like a pretty bleak picture that involves basically labor being on the back foot for many, many more years to come, which is kind of depressing.
Yeah. Yes, and this is the problem. I mean, generally speaking, if you look at this, I'm going to talk about long history. If you look at the history of capitalism, generally speaking, it has been outside of wars. There have been very few periods of inflation. And the only period of inflation that we've had significantly outside of wars is the 1970s. And that has somehow colored the whole profession that, inflation control, inflation targeting, this and that. But really, capitalism is characterized not by scarcity, which is what inflation is a manifestation of in some sense. Of course, there's other things too. It's not just scarcity, as we just looked at. It's also, capitalism is generally characterized by glut. You always are looking for markets. That's the whole thing. I mean, even Adam Smith understood that.
Right. That's the aim of capitalism, right?
Even Adam Smith, he didn't completely say it in so many words, but he said that, the extent of specialization is constrained by the extent of the market. So the real constraint has always been the market, demand in some sense.